it's Sam, and I have an important update for you today about the upcoming astrological weather. You know, from September 5th to September 16th, we're going to have an incredibly auspicious and rare alignment in the sky with 5 planets, either in their own signs or exalted. Jupiter in Cancer is exalted, the Sun is in its own sign in Leo, Mercury will be exalted and in its own sign in Virgo, Saturn will be exalted in Libra, and Mars will be in Scorpio, where he is the ruler. This is incredibly auspicious, and I'm going to talk about what that means now. So when planets are in their own sign or exalted, they're called Jagrat, or awake, and these Jagrat avashtas are a group of planetary conditions. There's actually 5 avashtas. Jagrat is one. And this talks about the level of consciousness of a planet. The most important thing to understand when you're looking at a planetary situation in a chart is its dignity, as far as when you want to understand the level of intelligence that comes into the actions that we take, you want to look at the dignity, and especially planets that are in their own sign, especially, and then also exalted, because they're going to be what's called Jagrat, or awake. Now, when planets are in their own sign, they're not only awake, but they're functioning within an environment that they rule, that they're in control of. When a planet is exalted, it's still awake, but it's not always in its own environment. In fact, the only planet that is exalted in its own sign is Mercury. Other planets are exalted in other signs, and it creates a bit of a wild card at times. It's hard to know whether or not that exalted planet is going to take the person away from their higher truth and dharma as a function of intelligence, or whether it's going to take them closer to it. For instance, a planet that's exalted like Jupiter, being exalted in Cancer, that's very good for certain types of ascending signs, like for Pisces and Scorpio, and even, Aries, and different ones. But others, it can be quite disruptive. For instance, for Libra type people, or Taurus, because Jupiter is what's called a functional malefic. It rules difficult houses. I'm not going to get into that whole thing here, but you want to understand there is a difference between exalted and in its own sign. So when the planet is in its own sign, as I said, it's not only in that high state of intelligence, but it's also operating the thing it's supposed to operate, because the planets rule houses and therefore signs that show the things that they bring into fruition. So we not only have planets that are in their own sign right now, which will be Mercury and Mars and the Sun. So those areas of life, Mercury, Mars, and Sun areas of life, whatever houses those planets rule and whatever those things indicate, will be functioning with a lot of consistency and power. But we also have 2 exalted planets, which is Jupiter and Saturn, which is still bringing a lot of intelligence, but might be also bringing some wild cards into the mix. For example, this Saturn exalted has been happening for the last several years. So it's exalted in Libra, which is the sign of relationships, and Saturn has actually been bringing a lot of difficulty into the relationships in order to show us the truth. This is an example of how an exalted planet doesn't necessarily give you what you want. It's not Santa Claus. It's to wake you up to something, but when it's exalted, it's often really powerful and really showing you the truth of that thing. But it might not necessarily, for instance, give you a good relationship. It'll often give you a relationship that shows you the mistakes you're making. And that's a lot of what's been happening in the last few years with the exalted Saturn. Jupiter has also been exalted since the middle of June. Jupiter is the planet of guru or teacher, and it's been bringing some confusion and some change of direction, perhaps, with our teachings. But in the midst of that, it's also been very inspiring and very devotional, because Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, which is quite devotional and not necessarily dogmatic, which is what Jupiter is. Again, one of the reasons Jupiter is exalted in Cancer is because it takes that sort of dogmatic religious nature of Jupiter and brings it into the heart, where, as far as the heart is concerned, dogmatism and all of that is irrelevant. It's how I feel. How do I feel? What really inspires me in my heart? Because that's what's going to be deeply a deep-rooted conviction. So Jupiter exalted can often disrupt our religion to connect us to the highest, most mystical promise of Jupiter, which is spirituality and authentic wisdom. So those 2 things are happening, and exalted Jupiter and Saturn will be continuing for the next several months. Saturn is going to be exalted until November of this year. Jupiter is going to stay exalted until July of 2015. But we also have, as I said, between now And September 16th, exalted Sun, which gives consistent power, focus, direction, meaning, and purpose in a consistent overall sense. Exalted Mercury, which gives us skill with all the details, the capacity to organize and to comprehend. Mercury is very important with comprehension. We gather a lot of information, but it's not really useful until we comprehend it. And the way you can tell whether or not you can comprehend something is if you can explain it. And I'll tell you this, myself as an astrology teacher, I constantly deal with this illusion of comprehension, or what I call it, this illusion of knowledge, because so many astrology students gather information here and there, especially now. I mean, it's good, but it's also kind of very sort of distracting, where they go from one YouTube teacher to another and gathering a lot of information thinking that it's knowledge. The way you can understand its knowledge is if you can explain it. If you can't explain it, then you don't comprehend it yet. Comprehension is more important than stimulation. And my latest mantra is memorization is not mastery. Memorizing a bunch of details is not mastery over them. You can memorize all of these things about astrology, for instance, but if you can't explain it, then you haven't mastered them. And it's not important to memorize all this stuff. It's important that you can explain and master what you, quote, already know. So again, this exalted Mercury is a great opportunity for us to really step in and to really connect with this possibility that's that we all could be a little bit better at, myself included. And we also have this Mars in Scorpio. So Mars is the ruler of Scorpio. Scorpio is an incredibly courageous sign, emotional courage. And that part of Mars and that part of us that is looking to strengthen our emotional vulnerabilities and weaknesses will be concentrated now, because the ruler, Mars, will be there. And so what this means is that rather than getting into these emotional battles of will with others as we try to prove that we're emotionally strong by controlling others or manipulating them or defeating them in some kind of emotional interaction to prove to ourselves that we're strong. This is the shadow side of Scorpio. Instead, we have the courage to really look at ourselves and look at our vulnerabilities and realize that the source of our weakness is internal, not external, and controlling others or projecting our pain onto someone else and blaming them and being in the victim role, and then of course perpetrating afterwards. This is the kind of perpetrator-victim role that Scorpio can get into when we feel vulnerable. It's like, oh, you did this to me, so now I'm justified in doing this to you, and it's just this cycle of pain in a less evolved sense. In the most evolved sense, it's Mars, the part of you that's pure courage. Mars steps up and faces this emotional pain and vulnerability and acts from a place of courage. You know, Scorpio is the part of all of us that fears our, you know, that we can lose the thing that's most precious to us, you know, and that our very life force itself can be sucked out of us if we lose this thing. We're terrified of losing something that we love so much, and Scorpio is where we defend that and where we're afraid of losing it. So all of these things will be functioning at a high level for the next several weeks between September 5th and September 16th. Jupiter, that connection to Guru and God's grace authentically. The Sun, which is your consistent power to manage and run and organize your kingdom in a consistent way rather than getting knocked off course because of things that you don't like in the moment. Mercury, your capacity to organize and comprehend. Saturn, your capacity to commit and be real, especially in your relationships with others. And and Mars, which is the capacity to authentically strengthen your emotional weaknesses rather than getting to battles with others, will all be supported. So I hope this was helpful. Share this with others and let me know what you think.